To look at this week in federal politics, I'm joined now by three MPs from the different parties. Erin O'Toole is the MP for Durham and Ontario and the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of International Trade. Paul Dewar is the NDP MP for Ottawa Centre and his party's Foreign Affairs critic. And Kevin Lamoureux is the Liberal MP for Winnipeg North and the Liberals' Deputy House Leader. Gentlemen, thanks for taking the time. Erin O'Toole, let's start with you. I have to ask about a question that was put to the Public Safety Minister today. Let's go back to yesterday. Yesterday, your colleague, Darryl Cramp, asked the Public Safety Minister, Stephen Blaney, about an alleged terrorist incident that was being reported by NBC News. We found out later that that report on NBC News, National American Television, was not correct. And yet yesterday, your colleague asks a question based on it, and the minister gives an answer and doesn't correct the record. And it was only today that we learned from the minister that, no, there is no imminent terrorist attack. Why did the minister not correct the record yesterday?
Well, I think the interesting thing, Martin, is that in the same day was also the day the RCMP commissioner and others revealed how many ongoing security investigations there were in Canada. So the same day there was media discussion about so-called threats, imminent threats in Canada. The number of 63 ongoing investigations with 90 Canadians being investigated and monitored for suspected terrorist activities came up, and there was a sort of a confluence of both issues. And this also came right after our debate on ISIL, where the opposition were sort of saying there is no threat to Canada.
Right, but I'm going to interrupt you, though, because during that testimony, both the Bob Poulsen of the RCMP and Michel Coulombe of the CSIS both said there is no imminent, we have no knowledge of an imminent threat against Canada. And then within hours, NBC, the national network, is going national on it. Why could the Minister of Public Safety not have picked up the phone on Wednesday night or Thursday morning or Thursday afternoon? Why did your fellow MP, a member of the government, Conservative MP, ask a question based on the NBC report after 12 hours of it flying out there?
Well, Martin, we should correct the record in cases where it needs to be corrected, and it seems that the NBC story you're referencing did come from years ago. At the same time, we also have to say that it's up to Canada and our investigatory arms, the RCMP, CSIS, and others, to stay vigilant. And that was sort of the purpose of the committee hearings this week, was to discuss the state of some of these investigations. So you're right, we've got to make sure the record is corrected. You know, we look back to after 9/11, some of the American news coverage that perpetuated this myth that some of the hijackers entered North America through Canada, which was not correct. But you still hear that out somewhere. So we should strive to correct the record.
Right, but I mean, I guess I'm going to belabor the point, but I mean, you know what people are saying in this town, and that is that if a Conservative MP gets up and asks a lob, as Darryl Cramp did, he's the chair of the committee, and he asks the minister, NBC is reporting this, and isn't it important to have anti-terrorist measures? And there's no correction made, and he's basing a question on that. Nothing gets by the PMO. These questions are not spontaneous and freelance. The minister doesn't correct the record. The suggestion is that you're just playing on this to make political hay, to make announcements, to use false information, an erroneous NBC report that the minister should have known about.
Well, Martin, I said previously, I'll say it again, we should correct the record. And but at the same time, we also can't let Canadians think that because there's an erroneous story that this isn't something we should be very carefully in monitoring. There are many investigations underway that came out this week at all. So like I said, I think for the minister it was probably the convergence of all issues in 1 week. Some are incorrect, like that story on NBC has been proven to be, and then some are not being named, but there's 63 investigations of 90 Canadians, and it should be an issue that we are vigilant on and make sure we correct false information in media stories, but also tell Canadians that we need to be aware and vigilant in terms of rooting out potentially young people that are getting brought into some of these networks, as we've seen in Canada.
Okay, Paul Dewar, what do you make of the state of the terrorist threat, the homegrown terrorist threat here in Canada, and this week's events?
Well, it was very stark, and I want to give Erin credit for acknowledging what I wish the minister would have done, that they made a mistake. And when someone owns up to it, I think you should give them credit. So I'll give Erin credit, and I hope that Minister Blaney will do the same on behalf of the government. But it was very stark at committee when you had the head of CSIS and the RCMP laying out the information. It was very important information. It was cogent information about about what the threats were, around the scope of the threats, and making sure that people well understood in a very balanced way what the situation was on the ground with regards to so-called homegrown terrorism. The problem was, and it was very stark, the juxtaposition, you had Minister Blaney going down the path of saying, oh, and there's these bad people here and we're going to find them and arrest them, as if there was cases that the RCMP were right now pursuing to convict and put people in prison on. It was strange, and I guess what I would note is that there seems to be a pattern here with the government. Instead of listening to the experts and getting information from them and then saying, okay, and our policy will be crafted based on that, we have this bizarre situation that you just outlined where the government is taking and conflating an NBC story, so from the American media, that turns out is from the past and is not relevant at all. So, I'm very concerned about that, and without trying to, and I know it might sound strange, make a partisan point here, it's about how policy is crafted, and it's about the message you send. And the reason I'm trying to be reserved in terms of the partisanship, this is extremely serious, and we should all take it serious. And I would hope that the government has learned a lesson on this, not to conflate things, and be very sober about it, and have your eyes wide open, and not get into that kind of game that can be played.
Right, because as you said, and as both the head of the RCMP and the head of CSIS said, this is a serious matter, and
we all take it seriously.
We need accurate information when it comes to matters of life and death like this. Kevin Lamoureau, what do you make of this week's developments on that front, on the front of domestic terrorism?
Well, first and foremost, Martin, I'm not quite as forgiving. In the sense that I believe that there was a fairly significant mistake that was made here. When you have a backbencher lob a question over, and the government uses that question as a way to make a statement to justify what it is that the government is actually doing, and doesn't have the courage to come back and say that, look, we messed up, and he apologizes. Imagine listening or being a part of a news track, or you might have caught wind of this statement being said, and many youth, thousands of youth across our country that actually go to malls on a nightly basis. There is an element of fear that was being referred to, that people should be concerned and so forth, and this is all based on what? 10 years ago. This is something that is somewhat significant, and we were surprised, and that's why we raised the issue today. Everyone is very much aware of what's taking place in the Middle East today, and they want to see transparency, they want accountability, and when you see this sort of thing taking place between a government backbencher and the minister, it does call into question some of the motivations and some of the rhetoric that we've heard coming from the government benches, Martin. So we do take it serious, and Martin, we would like to see the minister do the honourable thing and apologize to the House.
Okay,
Martin,
Aaron, go ahead, Aaron.
Yeah, Martin, I think we can't lose sight of the fact that, in terms of what Paul said, this is a relatively new phenomenon in Canada in the last 15 years or so, this homegrown terror phenomenon, and we still refer to the Toronto 18 and that terrorist plot that was foiled. Even though it was in the past, this is something that is new that law enforcement is working on. So we actually have to look at what's happened in the past since 9/11 in terms of some of the plots that have been foiled in the last few years, because there's been some of them. And then with the ISIL threat, we've seen some young people, a few from Calgary in particular. Some have left already. So these are people that were radicalized and were only learning once they leave, or they were being monitored. We're moving quickly to revoke passports, to look at some of these things, to make sure that, and to make it a crime to leave Canada for the purposes of training. So we have to look back at what's happened to learn, because this is something that didn't happen in previous conflicts. It's
right, but I think we would all agree that the most important element of any of this discussion is getting our information right and getting that information to the Canadian public. And if you can't do that, I want to just have a last point, and that is on the other huge event this week. We had the vote on the Iraq mission. It's now going ahead. We're preparing for airstrikes in Iraq, airstrikes on ISIL in Iraq. Aaron O'Toole, where do you see this as going from here? And I guess a lot of people are looking to you, the government party, and wondering if the Prime Minister is going to start briefings of the leaders of the opposition as the mission goes ahead.
Well, it's clear where it's going from here, Martin. The Prime Minister, in the motion that we voted on that you referenced, spelled out a 6-month timeline on a mission that includes up to 6 CF-18s to take part in strikes, but also Aurora surveillance aircraft and an air-to-air refueler, and the advisory mission that's going to continue. What we really want to see is Canada working with its allies to try and cut off support for ISIL and hopefully halt their advance and halt the killing. So with airstrikes, that can be reviewed on a daily, almost hourly basis, and Canadian aircrew will be able to select whether they take part on a target or not, and then they assess how that's having an impact. Is it saving lives? Is it halting the advance? So I think our general is coordinating with the Americans. So Canada, the CDS, will be running this. And I think as the mission has sorties and sort of operational information to report, I think it will be reported. And what's stark about this is we're the first party to bring a mission like this to the House for a full debate and vote. I think all of us here took part in that debate. It was important for me as someone who served in uniform to be a part of it. We had a vote. The NDP's always been fairly consistent in their position. We've seen the Liberals under Justin Trudeau take a radical turn, and most of the senior Liberals like Bob Rae and Lloyd Axworthy and Udall Desange don't think it's a responsible position, Kevin. So I think you see two parties that have sort of been of the same mind in terms of their respective positions, and the Liberals sort of vacillating week by week, and so we'll have to watch it unfold.
Okay, well, just briefly, let's just go to Paul Dewar. On the question, do you think you're going to get briefings? I know
it's
Thomas
a very good question. I was involved on the Libya mission and actually was working with my leader at the time, Mr. Layton, and John Baird, who was working with the Prime Minister to amend the motion for the Libya mission, and we were given full briefing. So I'll look forward to that. And the reason is that I was very concerned about the motion. Aaron's right, we have differences of opinion about what we should be doing, but one of the things we made sure that was in the Libya motion was that it was embedded, what was embedded in there was the UN Security Council resolution to give some guidance for the military and for those who have to carry out the motion. I'm very concerned, and this was highlighted by former Ambassador David Mulrooney this past weekend, about the lessons we should have learned from Afghanistan. And that is not just to have a motion and then hand it over to the military and say, you guys figure it out. There should be more detail and scope to allow the military to understand what the goals are, what your timelines are, what success looks like. And I'm not saying it's easy in terms of the success piece, but to at least lay that out. Because otherwise you're just handing it over. And listen, the military does what Parliament asks it to do. It's all in what is being asked, and I'm concerned about that.
Okay, on that note, we only have about 30 seconds left. Kevin Lemuro, your leader, Justin Trudeau, made the Prime Minister's handling of this the most important issue. So do you think you are going to get briefings henceforth as the mission starts?
Well, I guess we're eternal optimists. It sure would be nice if the Prime Minister would somehow reach out to opposition leaders. That would be the responsible thing to do. He hasn't done that, Martin, and that poses a bit of a problem. As you know, and your listeners would be aware, is that the Liberal Party supported the 30-day non-combat, let's see what happens type of thing. The Prime Minister has not answered a litany, and I had the chance to speak on behalf of the party inside the chamber during this debate. I listed off a litany of questions in which the Prime Minister has not been able to answer. What sort of alternatives was he provided? What were the options? As I say, there's a litany of questions, and he just is not being forthright and telling Canadians in terms of what's actually taking place. And we have real concerns. We're calling on the Prime Minister to start working with the opposition parties to share some of this dialogue that's taking place so that we're better informed and better able to provide advice to the government.
Okay, on that note, we're going to have to wrap it up. I know all three of you are heading off back to your ridings for the next week. I want to wish you a happy and productive time and a happy Thanksgiving.
To you as well, Martin.
You too, Martin.